You're live.
Hello, my name is Elizabeth Weiss. I am the Federal Treasurer of Socialist Action and the Steering Committee of the NDP Socialist Caucus. We acknowledge that this gathering takes place on Indigenous lands, including the unceded territories of the Mississauga of the New Credit, the Window, and the Haudenosaunee people. We join in the fight for justice, recognizing that there can be no real reconciliation without restitution. That entails seizing the assets of the big resource corporations and returning them to the commons. Tonight's webcast is titled The Mental Health Crisis Under Capitalism, with presenter Daniel Torre and discussants Judy Kosh of Socialist Action, Greg Luca from Fridays for Future, Loretta Fisher from Spring Magazine, and Sebastian Mendoza Price, who works with the Afro-Indigenous Rising in Toronto. Daniel will give a talk for about 10 minutes. After that, each discussant will speak up to about 7 minutes. Then we will take a few questions from the online audience. Audience members can submit a question by accessing the webcast from YouTube and by typing questions directly on the chat column. Please direct your questions to a specific person. If you like this webcast, please subscribe to the Socialist Action YouTube channel. If you agree with what you hear in the program, please join Socialist Action by signing up on our website, www.socialistaction.ca, or by calling 647-986-1917. That's 647-986-1917. So let's begin. Daniel Torre is a member of the Socialist Action National Leadership Body and a PhD candidate at the University of Toronto in laboratory medicine and pathobiology. Welcome, Daniel.
Hi, Elizabeth. Thank you. Good evening, sisters, brothers, siblings, and comrades. My name is Daniel Torre. I am a member of Socialist Action. I'm a PhD student at the University of Toronto. Tonight, we talk about mental health, a topic that comes up more and more. But I find that the way politicians, corporations, and mainstream media talk about anxiety, depression, suicide, they neglect the systemic roots of despair in our society. A perfect example is Bell Let's Talk, where a telecom oligarch asks Canadians to share their mental health struggles to help reduce stigma. Nothing wrong with reducing stigma, it's important. But when the conversation ignores why people are anxious, depressed, suicidal, these struggles are normalized. People begin to frame a solution in terms of building personal resilience, that anxiety and depression and suicide are normal and we just need to learn how to defend ourselves. And that's bunk. Of course, we can learn how to cope and attend therapy and take medication to feel better and lessen the burden. I'm not against that. I do all of those things. But, and for the same reason, activists call on the federal government to build a mercury treatment center in Grassy Narrows, which was promised by the Trudeau government in 2017, still not built. This is necessary to deal with the symptoms of mercury poisoning. But unless we identify the cause, which is capitalism, imperialism, and settler colonialism, nothing will change in the long run. And if you need any evidence that that is true, just consider that the same Liberal government sent Canada's federal police, the RCMP, to invade the Wet'suwet'en Nation this past February. By focusing only on what the individual can do to fight against mental illness after it's already manifested, we blame the victim and ensure a continued cycle of distress, trauma, and tragedy. So instead, we need to address the role of capitalism and how to dismantle this toxic system. But before we do that, let's make sure we're on the same page and let's talk about the extent of this crisis, because even though it gets talked about a lot, I think the scope of it is still not fully grasped by everybody. The mental health crisis manifests as stress, anxiety, depression, loneliness, addiction, eating disorders, social phobia, self-harm, and suicide. There's a lot of ways people can be affected. And according to the Center for Addiction and Mental Health, 1 in 2 Canadians will have had a mental illness by the time they reach 40. In Ontario, 1 in 8 deaths occurring in people between 25 and 34 are due to the opioid crisis. And in BC, in British Columbia, in 2020, more people have died from opioids so far than from coronavirus, which just puts this into perspective. Overall, 4,000 people die a year from suicide in Canada. According to Stats Canada, this is the 9th leading cause of death in Canada in total. And among 15 to 34-year-olds, it is the 2nd leading cause of death. And what I'm often most troubled by is how much this affects young people. 4% of high school students reported having attempted suicide in the previous year. That's 1 in 25 high school students. I also want to talk about the intersection of mental health with other forms of oppression. Mental health crises are rampant, but they do not affect all populations equally. In a monthly review article, authors Paul Barron and Paul Sweezy discussed that, quote, all national and ethnic groups, so far as we know, have the same potentials for mental illness or mental health. If some fare worse than others, it is because their society fails to foster healthy development and instead inflicts them with unnecessary suffering and evil, end quote. So then it is not surprising that according to the Centre for Addiction and Mental Health, Indigenous youth in Canada die by suicide at 5 times the rate of non-Indigenous youth. Inuit youth die at 11 times the rate. These numbers are not unique to Canada, and they are reported on with grim regularity. But what we aim to do tonight is to start a conversation about what actually needs to change in society if we are to meaningfully intervene in the mental health crisis. As socialists, I like to use this phrase, we seek to terraform our planet so that all humans can not only survive, but thrive. But to do so, we must overthrow a capitalist system based on profit above all else, where the 1% plunders the world and the working class suffers mentally, physically, and emotionally. So broadly speaking, what is the connection between capitalism and mental health? Marx described alienation as the result of a sentient human with desires for freedom and self-expression and self-determination being boxed in by the capitalist class that owns the means of production. Marx recognized that humans have passions and a desire to connect with others and with nature, but instead we spend most of our waking life working for others with little to no say about what work is being done or how it is being done, and being given just a small amount of the wealth that we generate. That is why a fundamental demand of socialists is to seize the means of production and to democratize our workplaces. There's much propaganda about the freedom we have in our capitalist societies, but all this boils down to is consumer freedom, as if having 50 different brands of shampoo to choose from is real freedom. For me, freedom has to do more with being able to genuinely choose how to live one's life without the existential threat of hunger and homelessness. When the capitalist ruling class makes decisions based on profit, the jobs available in society do not reflect what humans need to survive or thrive, and working conditions are poor. It is all about maximal extraction, and this is at odds with our human collaborative nature. We talk about dream jobs from when we were young, as if the most important decision we will ever make is how we will sell our labor. We can't wait for the weekend, as if it is reasonable for us to resent how we spend 5/7 of our week. And for many, retirement is the goal because that's when they can finally do the things that they've always wanted to do, as if it isn't messed up that people have to wait 50 to 60 years to be able to live the fulfilling life that they want. So in capitalist society, competition is the name of the game. The working class, we fight with each other for a diminishing slice of the pie while the capitalists hoard all the wealth. So rather than a collaborative community, schools and workplaces become battlegrounds. Normally, if someone succeeds, that should be a good thing for that community. They've gained new skills, they can help other people, everybody benefits. But it is not a benefit if that means that that person, instead of you, gets an internship, interview, job, or promotion. Instead, their success becomes a detriment to you and your ability to make sure your basic needs are met. Instead, in this environment, isolation and alienation is rampant. With that, let me talk about the role of universities and colleges. So as a student who has suffered multiple extended bouts of anxiety, depression, and suicidal ideation, this is something I can speak to with confidence and experience. And in fighting the administration at the University of Toronto and teaming up with brilliant people on campus, brilliant activists, I've come to see the university as a microcosm of our society. Its tactics are the same tactics used by the neoliberal governments and the corporations. But first, some context. Campuses are pretty bleak these days. A 2016 National College Health Assessment Survey found that 65% of Canadian students reported feeling overwhelming levels of anxiety, and 44% reported difficulty functioning due to depression within the last 12 months. And for me, again, more troubling is that 1 in 45 students reported a suicide attempt in the previous year. This is amplified, this mental health crisis in our society, by a pedagogy on campus that has changed little over the years. We, as students, are faced with strict deadlines, large classes, punitive classes where people lose grades and that's what you're competing for. People are meant to learn independently, even if that doesn't work for them as well as it should. People are made to memorize just textbooks, and examinations are inflexible in the way they're administered. Classes are not designed this way so that people learn better, but it's to weed out people that cannot survive the pressure. Everyone can learn if consulted as an equal partner in their education, but the ideal worker is the person that can weather turmoil and abuse without needing extra provisions. School is just a rite of passage for people before they sell their labor. So with this in mind, it's not surprising that within a recent 18-month period, 3 Toronto students died of suicide in the same building on campus, publicly. What was the response of students? They organized. They formed a mental health policy group that identified systemic issues on campus that underlies the mental health crisis and forwarded concrete demands to improve the situation. A spotlight was placed on rampant sexual violence, a lack of Black representation among professors, lecturers, and professional and graduate students. And specifically, they criticized the university-mandated leave of absence policy, where students can be involuntarily placed on leave of absence if the administration felt the student was a threat to themselves or others. In instituting this policy, the university made it clear that students were to be dealt with rather than listened to. What were the demands made by this Mental Health Policy Council? They demanded that the administration recognize, support, and not impede a student-led initiative designed to garner feedback from students and hold the university accountable in its duty to accommodate students. They demanded 24-hour counseling during exams and other stressful periods. They demanded an increase in the number of full-time and fairly compensated staff to shorten wait times on campus while trying to access mental health resources. They demanded repealing of the university-mandated leave of absence program, and they demanded that all university committees or task forces on student mental health be comprised of 50% plus 1 students. Now, these are great demands for the short term. And if these demands were met, it would buy us time to radically restructure our university while preventing the tragedies that have become commonplace. But how did the university respond? They ignored their students. They struck a task force of 13 people that had only 4 students on it. And their messaging was focused on resiliency, as if the situation on campus can't be improved. The only thing that can be improved is our attitudes and the way we deal with the things on campus. So they talked about us being on our smartphones too much. They suggested yoga. It was very, very disrespectful, obviously, in the face of tragedies. They did what every neoliberal government does, what every workplace does. They put it on us as individuals. What didn't they do? Well, they didn't stop exploiting international students who pay 5 times higher tuition for a chance to study in North America and are underserved in return. They didn't enact policies to remedy the punitive nature of scholasticism on campus, where it's up to individual professors to decide how much to deduct from a student if they turn in an assignment late. They didn't do anything about tuition fees that keep rising, nothing to help students afford rent, nothing to divest from fossil fuel companies, nothing to curb sexual violence, nothing to fight against Ford's divide and conquer strategy that allows students to opt out of student fees that are needed to fund crucial services on campus, which I analogize to right to work legislation. And those are the key things that need to change in the long term to prevent the mental health crisis in the first place that occurs in so many students. Things like installing subway barriers to prevent suicide, funding safe injection sites to prevent overdose, ensuring every person has access to a psychologist or a psychiatrist or to a social worker is important. I support all of that. It buys us time, it prevents unnecessary harm and suffering. But this only deals with the aftermath, the system, or the symptoms of austerity, of capitalism. Ideally, 50% of students should not struggle with depression in any given year. That, to me, seems like the obvious thing to remedy, not whether or not they end up dying of suicide. That's important as well, but we need to take a step back too. But capitalists show time and time again that they're willing to make this trade-off. They are willing to accept that the 9th leading cause of death is suicide if that means they can exploit the people who survive. So they gaslight us. They tell us we ought to be happy, that we live in the most peaceful time in human history, that global poverty is being eradicated before our eyes, that humans have more freedom than ever. But in doing so, they appeal to a Hegelian dialectic, that human experience is dependent on the mind's perception. If we just buy into the myth of capitalism, then we will be happy. And that's what our problem is, that we're not buying into the myth. This reminds me of Western Buddhism, where people are just trying to and practice acceptance of the things that bother them, which is really the capitalist wet dream, that we all just give in, collectively shrug our shoulders, accept that things aren't going to get better, and just try and survive in our own daily grind. But Marxist theory instead builds upon dialectical materialism, which emphasizes the importance of real world conditions in terms of class and labor and socioeconomic interactions. If you are a materialist, you can look at the mental health crisis, the opioid crisis, the suicide crisis as evidence of a society with awful material conditions for the working class. And to say otherwise is to gaslight people, plain and simple. I want to finish quickly by touching on the intersection of COVID-19 and mental health. I personally became very interested in how the suicide crisis manifests specifically in the Toronto subway system. A few years back, I rode on a train one Sunday afternoon that struck a person, and that was very eye-opening for me just to see how it is for so many people in our society. So since then, I've just been trawling publicly available subway notifications on Twitter to see if there are trends. And I found that this past spring, when the quarantine was enacted, there was the largest number of suicides in the Toronto subway system for any spring going back to 2013, which is the furthest back I had any data. But this isn't surprising. People are being isolated even more than normal. There are an unprecedented number of people facing eviction and hunger and homelessness. People's loved ones are dying alone in for-profit long-term care facilities that put their profit ahead of their loved ones. But what scares me the most is that they're weaponizing this mental health crisis. We're hearing from conservative politicians and corporate leaders that we need to accelerate the reopening, that people are struggling being home all by themselves. But we should know better by now what their real intention is. They just want us back at work where we risk our lives at a minimum wage job to help them make profit. That has always been the relationship between the capitalists and the working class. I'm going to wrap up really quickly here with what we try and do in Socialist Action, because what we need to do is build our own alternatives, our own communities. We need to fight for unions. We need to fight for stronger, more militant unions. We must demand nationalization and democratization of our corporations, starting with those that are most essential: the energy sector, the healthcare sector, mental care, dental care, airlines, pharmaceutical manufacturing, our farms. Only when workers come together and put our collective needs first will we see a general human flourishing. What is the path towards this vision? Socialist revolution led by a vanguard party of leaders from diverse backgrounds experienced in class struggle. That is what it takes. And that is what we aim to build, employing the United Front strategy, working with all other socialist and activist groups that agree with our goal of dismantling capitalism. I will finish by directly challenging the corporate gaslighting around the mental health crisis, that we just ought to build resilience and not be bothered by the shortcomings of our society. This all reminds me of an Angela Davis quote where they said, "I am no longer accepting the things I cannot change. I am changing the things I cannot accept." The former is the neoliberal sedative fed to us en masse. But by adopting the latter mentality of changing the things that we cannot accept, that is what makes us revolutionary. And so I invite all of you to join in the collective struggle. It is not always easy. It can be hard, exhausting work. But for me, it is only in the class struggle, in the mass struggle, that I have found my purpose. Thank you, and I look forward to the discussion.
Thank you very much, Daniel. Excellent, very educational, and your analysis, in my opinion, is right on the mark. Okay, so let's move along to Judy Kosh. She's a long-time socialist, a long time, over 50 years actually. And presently, she organizes press sales and outreach for Socialist Action in Toronto. So welcome, Judy.
Capitalism and bad mental health go together. I have been involved with the mental health system since 1977. I first went to treatment for saying crazy things which I will not repeat. A friend had me admitted. Initially, I saw a psychologist. She was a political person. After that, I saw no doctor regularly. I depended on taking certain medications to curb my schizophrenia, so-called. The nurses at Queen Street Mental Health Center in Toronto told me that the cure was to read socialist and feminist literature. That may have been the best advice I ever got from a healthcare provider. They introduced me to the anti-psychiatric movement. Even though I escaped from the hospital, which I shouldn't have done, I was on a 30-day required admittance. They said that they gave me a leave of absence to go to Montreal for the birth of my niece and for the convention where the League for Socialist Action and the Revolutionary Marxist Group united. That was in 1977. I was not required to see a psychiatrist. I was released from the hospital and from the 30-day requirement as soon as I got back from Montreal. The next time I was admitted was around 1979. It was for not taking my medication. The staff told me I should not be a socialist. At the same time, they let me go and allowed me to cook my meals at home. I had to report to the hospital only once a day, and then I could sleep at home. The next time I was admitted was in 1979. My father took me there. Even before I was admitted to the hospital, a friend of mine who was a psychiatrist said I did not need psychiatric help, while other friends thought I did. The mental health center sent me to a sheltered workshop. The pay was $50 to $20 a week. This was considered to be therapeutic. I witnessed other people who were subjected to questionable treatment. One was a woman who was admitted by her parents for overspending money. She was given electric shock. Gays and lesbians were also given shock treatment. Electroshock destroys parts of the brain. It is irreversible. This is a big difference from the way psychiatry is practiced in Cuba. In revolutionary Cuba, psychiatric patients are treated with respect and are soon rehabilitated so that they can get decent jobs. In Canada, people who are put in psychiatric hospitals for committing crimes are mistreated and often get worse. Mental health crimes Mental health must be rescued from a system that tries to minimize spending on the sick. We need to be rescued from a system that sends heavily armed police to intervene in situations where there are people experiencing mental crisis. Capitalism favors repression and the subordination of human needs to the private profit system. Under socialism, the needs of the working class, especially people with mental and physical disabilities, will come first. Since 1979, I have been able to live my life with medications to suit my needs. I have not needed admittance to a psychiatric hospital. I live on my own in my own home and look after myself with any help I need from my Socialist Action comrades.
Thank you very much, Judy, and thank you for sharing your experiences with us, comrade. Okay, we move now to Greg Luca, and he has been involved with Friday for Future Toronto for over a year. His work began with showing solidarity and support at events to organizing within the group. He led climate strikes in the past and was one of the Fridays for Future representatives present at the anti-PDAC rally. Welcome, Greg.
Thank you, Elizabeth. All right. To begin, I would like to explain how climate change can affect mental health. There are two distinct ways that climate change can affect mental health, and one is that people can experience psychological responses from direct exposure to the consequences of climate change. So to put it in more layman's terms, that means things like natural disasters or droughts, will affect people mentally. There is a long process afterwards after the natural disaster of rebuilding, which takes a heavy toll on people. Public Health Association and Eco America found that up to 54% of adults and 45% of children experience depression after a disaster. And after a disaster, Dr. Joshua Morgenstein says that most people will experience common psychological responses such as insomnia, irritability, risky behaviors like substance abuse, and loss of interest in normal activities. These are called distress reactions. Now, these distress reactions will usually go away, but if the root cause of the issue is not taken care of, they will exacerbate into further mental illness. And the second way that climate change can affect mental health is through watching things happening to other people. You may not be experiencing it fully, but we can see Australia ablaze. We can see locust swarms of biblical proportions eating their way through Africa. And we can see Indonesia sinking. We know that we'll have to deal with climate migration later. So that takes a toll, and that takes a toll in the way of eco-grief, eco-anxiety, and eco-fear, which is when you experience grief or anxiety or fear, negative emotions because of the state of our world and environment so far. Now, I would like to talk about, besides climate change and mental health, I would like to talk about how mental health is put on the individual in society. It's always said that you have to, as Daniel mentioned, be more resilient, but people don't realize that most of the advice aimed at individuals to make lifestyle changes is short-sighted, as an individual's capacity to follow advice is only qualified by opportunity structures, social determinants, and services that they have accessible to them. Now, those are deficient in the populations that need them the most. So that's minority communities and impoverished communities that have been exploited by capitalism for generations. And there are 6 core concepts in the way that mental health climate change relates to mental health. 1, unethical conduct by government and big businesses has aggravated the root cause of mental illness, which includes climate change. One outcome of climate change is increased intensity and frequency of natural disasters. These disasters generate 3, widespread destruction and upheaval to people and places, and 4, put pressure on multiple domains of public resources, including those related to health. This 5 strains community functioning, which results in the deterioration of a person's personal and material and emotional resources, which 6 stresses mental health and well-being, ultimately increasing likelihoods of mental illness. So basically that's saying that all of the things happening with climate change, so even the minute stuff like ticks coming into Ontario more and just longer, hotter summers, things like that, affect people's mental well-being. And I'd like to focus on some solutions because it seems like a bit of a hopeless scenario, but really it's not. People can come together in the form of activism or discussion to ease eco-anxiety, grief, and fear, studies have found. The act of communicating with each other, making bonds, and actually realizing that we're not alone in our struggles helps ease the mind. And besides that, we need nationalization of mental health, like care, so therapy, whatever, mental wellness checks, crisis teams to respond to things instead of police, because we're living in the middle of a mental health crisis. Who has suggested that 300 million people suffer from depression globally, and approximately 800,000 individuals commit suicide annually? That is an absurd number. We need to start taking care of our people because we can't survive or thrive in a system that does not take care of us. Now, I don't really have too much more to say, and I don't want to go over my time. So thank you for listening to me, and I can answer I can give more information when we're doing the Q&A.
Thank you very much, Ray. I'm seeing trouble here.
I couldn't hear you. Did you say my name?
Yes, I did. Can you hear me now? Something went wrong with my screen. I don't know what.
Yeah, you were still actually logged in, though. Go ahead.
Okay. Sorry about that to the panelists and to the audience that's watching. Cyberspace can be crazy sometimes. Okay. Loretta Fisher is a freelance socialist journalist and poet who writes with a view to making core ideas crystal clear. She is a member of Spring Socialist, the Workers' Action Center, and the Voices of Scarborough. Welcome, Loretta.
Thank you. Thank you very much for inviting me. I have really appreciated all the speakers, and I was listening to our police chief, the city police chief Saunders, Mark Saunders. Um, uh, he seems to be retiring now. Everybody deserves to be retiring sometime, but for some reason, I just have this feeling that he's jumping ship. I was not really. I really had to cringe in pain while he talked about um, the fact that we need more policing because there are a lot of black youth, and they're not they're dropping out, and that is a symptom of the system of, and it's just a talking point. It's just he didn't mention that it's a symptom of actually black families being impoverished. He didn't mention that it's a system of our students being de-streamed, being disrespected and ignored by their counselors who are de-streaming them, by police who are called into our schools. So the police are called on our black students more than anyone. And so I don't understand why he's just talking about dropouts without talking about how the system is what is making them excluded. Um, so we're people who have been deliberately impoverished by this system that's designed to exclude us, who've had the condition of impoverishment imposed on us. Therefore, impoverishing particular sections of the population is an act of violence. That's what this whole thing is about. It's not just a symptom that just popped up that suddenly people are. Anyway, how can a police service be effective when the majority of hardworking people aren't even allowed to explain what the crimes against them are? When working class people who are black, indigenous, or people of color try to stand up and tell the authorities what the real crimes against us are, how we are being hurt, targeted, or cheated, that is the time when we're likely to be brutalized or killed. There is a smaller and richer part of the population called the ruling class who do get to decide what the crimes are. Even while police officers are intentionally recruited from many black, indigenous, people of color neighborhoods, it's clear that police are meant to protect capital, rich people, and their property. Wage theft happens all the time. Yet workers cannot call the police on their boss when our wages are not paid. Instead, employers get to call the police to remove a former employer who is asking, but it's misnamed harassing, but we're simply asking for fair payment of the wages we are owed. Even if an individual cop sees the injustice done to the worker that he's removing, no cop has any jurisdiction to help the real victims of the real crimes. Ontario police already receive billions in funding, yet the Ontario government has cut millions of dollars from the Ministry of Labour that's mandated to help the workers. That in reality does next to nothing to collect all the money still owed to the working poor. And I also believe that they want their millions so that they can keep building their prisons. They have lots and lots of money and lots of plans to build more prisons. Every citizen, but I say every citizen across Canada, regardless of our race, everyone deserves to feel safe. not just the white rich population. We have to rally and demand an end to the problematic privilege, historically prioritizing one race above all others and allowing unchecked cruelty and the dehumanization of Black and Indigenous people of color. Scarborough is mislabeled as dangerous, a dangerous place where anyone can come in, target us with violence, and say that, or stir us up into violence and say that we and our children, because we're poor, should be charged, incarcerated, and sent indefinitely to immigration detention centers because we're Black, Indigenous, or people of color. What we're finally realizing is that the current system is designed to target us this way. What we're finally realizing is that the ruling class makes billions of dollars for putting us in prison. In diverse communities like Scarborough, and this has been highlighted during COVID-19, Black, Indigenous, and people of color are being targeted, criminalized, brutalized, and the huge problem is an underlying racist system that never has to admit racism. So no matter how much sensitivity training is provided to police, their ultimate goal is to protect themselves from our so-called criminal element and to protect themselves from all blame. What other employees get suspended with pay for murdering someone? Plus, there is a biased, entrenched process of searching for criminals using stereotypical assumptions about Black, Indigenous, and people of color. These biased and inaccurate assumptions use damaging ideas that come from many sources, mainly mainstream TV. For Indigenous people, it was the Western Indians and cowboys. But now we've got those really troubling police shows. Perpetuating myths in real life all across Scarborough and North America ends up targeting and killing many innocent residents. Or putting us in danger so that next thing we know, we're standing at a subway station or anywhere and suddenly have police surrounding us. 2 summers ago, I entered the subway by using my Metro Pass. It was the interim time, so I was able to use my Metro Pass, and I went through correctly. And a colleague of mine followed through behind me. And also because it was the interim time, the turnstile stayed stuck open because they had issues. So she followed directly behind me, and she did not wait for the turnstile to close. And so 2 large security guards jumped out from behind the wall and accosted us, accused me of using my card improperly, even though I had paid my fare. They accused me of colluding with my white friend, saying it was me who probably encouraged her to evade her fare, even though she had her Presto card temporarily lost, but then she found it in the bottom of her purse. She found it in front of the guards and wanted to swipe it, but they didn't let her, choosing instead to fine each of us hundreds of dollars, even though we cooperated. My friend's husband kept telling them it wasn't fair to ticket us and that this was harassment. Please don't do it. In response to his demands, the guards called the police. So now there were police and guards surrounding us. My fears of escalation grew as my friend's husband continued to complain out loud about our unfair treatment. They fined us each $350 anyway. Ouch. Mugged by TTC guards, plus the police poised to use lethal force against us. In retrospect, I'm thinking, what if my friend's husband was a Black guy instead, who was repeatedly telling police and guards to stop harassing us? How much time would a person of color have been tolerated and complaining before the police decided he was argumentative and resisting their authority? Because my companion's husband was not Black, his protests were not automatically perceived as aggression. And this is the precise difference of why he was afforded the chance to survive such a potentially volatile incident, where a Black or Indigenous person of color would likely not have been afforded the same opportunity, according to what we have seen. all across North America. Another near deadly experience was when a young close relative required mental health assistance. I wasn't going to go into horrific details, but I have to mention because of Daniel's presentation that this person was in university, their first year of university, and that is what precipitated the crisis. So that's what led to us arriving at an emergency room of a hospital where my young relative was afraid, suddenly took off out of the hospital, and never being in such a situation before, I was desperate for a solution. The one and only option offered by the healthcare staff present was to call police to go find her. She was tracked down on a city bus and marched back to the hospital. Not guilty of anything, but being terrified even more, but to the public looking like a person who must have broken the law. Even though he knew she hadn't broken any laws, one of the cops was determined to verbalize his racist assumptions. He grabbed her aggressively, growled racial slurs all the way back to the hospital. Finally releasing his tight grip on her, he pushed her into a chair and said she seemed like a smart girl, but would be better off putting her energy into her schoolwork. This officer was telling a story about her without knowing that, in fact, as a straight A student, she had recently won academic awards and a university scholarship. Anyway, the incident was clearly a mental health crisis, where a person needs specific, compassionate health care. Instead of guiding helpfully without aggression back to appropriate help, these cops completely re-traumatized her due to the color of her skin. Of course, you can well imagine what could have easily happened if my young relative resisted out of fear. If I could only go back in time, for us and for all others who tried to cope in this type of quickly unfolding scenario, I would say, please. I'm just checking. Is my microphone too noisy?
No, we can hear you.
Okay.
No, if you could wrap up though, sister, I'd appreciate it.
I would say, please do not send the police. They are not trained to help any people in this scenario. Instead, please send professionally qualified mental health crisis team. Guns are never necessary in these situations. Bad enough suspected criminals are being executed by cops in the streets, but why are so many innocent mental health patients also suffering the same fate? Through over-policing, criminalizing those who aren't criminals. To stop these unnecessary killings, we demand to defund the police and reallocate tax funds into better trained hospital services who are not going to just call in the cops. I vote to defund, reallocate funding, and rebuild a safer police system for Scarborough. Thank you for listening.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Okay, next will be Sebastian Mendoza Price. He is a queer Latinx settler, student, and community organizer. They work to support actions that center on Black, Indigenous, and migrant voices, and currently back the Indigenous youth-led project Land Back Camp at 305 Dawes Road in Toronto East End. Welcome, Sebastian. Is your mic on?
Yes, I think
Okay.
you can hear me. Okay, good.
Yes.
Okay, so probably gonna cut my speech a little bit short. Unfortunately, one of the folks I work with, there was an arrest at 14th Division. A Black trans woman was arrested, Mocha Dawkins. So if anybody on this live stream is in Toronto and wants to support 14th Division, the 350 Dover Court Road, Not Another Black Life is doing direct action outside the police station, trying to get information about like her arrest and when she is going to be released because she's still currently detained. With that said, I'm going to speak a little bit about the conditions that colonialism and capitalism have created to create such a terrible mental health crisis today, and then integrate a bit of my work into that and provide possibly some alternatives of how communities can work to create better conditions, even if it seems like small potatoes in the grander scheme. So in 2016 in Ottawa, a mentally ill Somali man by the name of Abdirahman Abdi was beaten to death by the police in a moment that jump-started my own activism into a long crusade to challenge the racism perpetuated by state actors, private companies, neo-Nazis, and unfortunately too many times people who claim to espouse progressive views. Abdirahman Abdi suffered from an undisclosed mental illness and had been repeatedly hospitalized. His crime was groping a woman, though it had been made quite clear quite quickly that he did not actually understand the social consequences of this action. A few years prior, he had been hospitalized with a friend of mine, a Black woman who has had more than a dozen hospital visits over the course of a decade, generally stemming from bipolar disorder, which for her was often triggered during moments of work and financial related stress. It is important to understand the power dynamics created here under the conditions of capitalism. Abdirahman Abdi was a man who didn't work, had been in and out of the system, which is an inadequate network of mental health services that too often use punishment as treatment, and was killed in a cafe by police for touching a white woman, someone who society inherently deemed more valuable than him. And he also dared to enter that space as someone who was neurodivergent, which ultimately led to his death at the hands of the state. My friend, who is, I guess, in a lot of ways more lucky because she's still here with us, faces punishment on an ongoing basis when she cannot produce value with her labor. About every 2 years, friends and family face serious concern that her hospital admittance may result in her death, again, also at the hands of the state. So it's important that we understand these dynamics in order to understand how capitalism creates and exacerbates the mental health crises that we see today. What exactly does capitalism and colonialism, which I think is important to engage as its own cultural phenomenon separate from capitalism, even if it was born out of it, what do these two things do? So where do I even start? Capitalism and colonialism force migrant workers to work abroad in harrowing conditions, to leave their land and children without a parent, all to enter into a horrifying network of indentured servitude. Capitalism and colonialism forces young people to abandon their culture, lose their mother tongue and ancestral way of life, often to be clumped up in cities, living in unsanitary conditions, desperately waiting for the littlest of breaks. Capitalism and colonialism created residential schools. It vastly expanded slavery. It created the racist streaming practice in schools today, and it traps workers in obscene amounts of debt. Capitalism and colonialism see profit where there is nature, harmony, and peace, and seeks to fundamentally disrupt all of those things in order to make said profit from it. It is why children in the Andes, which is my part of the world, who relied on quinoa go hungry. It is why traditional healers who work with their communities to combat mental, physical, and spiritual health cannot access their traditional herbs and medicines, as the mostly white population in the global north is appealed to its aesthetics and scents. Capitalism and colonialism has turned necessary therapy into a for-profit industry, and it's also why August 1st and September 1st and so on, the day that rent is due, occupy the minds of so many Torontonians, and probably many on this stream as well, in an unhealthy way. It's why $2,000 was the difference between literal life and death for 8 million Canadians, why loneliness is at an all-time high, suicides are more frequent than they should be, and police are killing those who struggle under the monstrous system created by the state. But there is a better way. And the great thing is that no one on this stream or on this call right now is powerless when it comes to beginning to work on crafting this way forward. People, including myself, are working with communities on the front line right now. I am working with an Indigenous youth camp at 305 Dallas Road that is providing land-based teaching to houseless Indigenous youth. And as of yesterday, we have ensured that all youth in the camp have housing as of August 1st. Organizations such as Glad Day Bookstore, Climate Justice Toronto, Not Another Black Life are raising or have raised funds for some of the most vulnerable members of our communities. If let's say 20 people on this stream donated $20 towards the work my collective is doing in St. Jamestown right now, we could ensure that for the next month, over 100 residents in the area could get a hot meal every week when we do tabling actions and mutual aid efforts every Saturday. Community care, which has many names, you might know this mutual aid or mutualism, is the way forward. And it is often, it can often be an inadequate and scrappy grassroots initiative, but it does help dozens of individuals feel a safety net that capitalism does not provide, and allows them to work on tackling their mental health in a safe and meaningful way. It allows us to build dual power that challenges the state while keeping members of our community safe, secure, and able to tackle the mental health challenges in front of them. So I want all of those on this stream to think about how they can integrate supporting community care initiatives in their life. Can you donate 10% of your salary to help frontline activists? Can you join activists on the front line yourself and help transform lives? Can you add your experiences and input into organizations as someone who may have struggled with mental or physical illness? Are you checking in with your neighbors or coworkers? So I'll close out by letting folks know about a solidarity fund I'm managing right now that is helping out 3 initiatives covering housing expenses for the vulnerable members of the community, building up the St. Jamestown Tenants Network so we could ensure all tenants we work with have their needs met, and supporting the Project Land Back Indigenous Youth-Led Occupation at 305 Dow's Road. It's a bit informal right now, our solidarity fund, and I'm gonna send it right now to our video technician so that folks can also have it. But any funds that anybody is ever interested in terms of supporting some of these initiatives, and they can do an e-transfer at my email, which is sebimp@gmail.com, or PayPal, SEBAS, the first part of my name, Sebas, MP, Mendoza Price, 1998. And every week I update on Facebook, which is my full name, Sebastian Mendoza Price, about what work is being done in the community and where the money is going towards. I thank you all so much for being on this call or being on this live stream and listening to the work that I'm doing. And I really do hope that y'all start putting community care initiatives into your life and putting them to the kind of front of your mind, because they do go a long way to helping people out. And I think that they can really go a long way to changing how we envision community and how we tackle mental health as neighbors, as friends, as coworkers, etc. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sebastian. Very educational and inspiring. You're doing a lot of good work. Okay, so now with the help of our technical producer, we're going to hear some questions from our online audience. And as we said earlier, before we went on air, hopefully you have a pen and paper, because our producer will be putting forward 3 questions to start with. And you each have up to about 4 minutes to answer. You can answer 1, 2, or 3. It depends on you, or not any at all. It's completely up to you, and we will try our best to keep you strictly on time. And if you, excuse me, we will both put 30 seconds in the chat column, but if you don't see that, I may interrupt you and say your time's up. Okay, so once you get the questions, the list will go like this. Loretta will be first, Sebastian will be second, Judy will be third, Greg will be fourth, and Daniel fifth. So it's Loretta, Sebastian, Judy, Greg, and Daniel. Okay, Kurt, could you put forward the 3 questions?
Yeah. So I will start. Our first question comes from Barry Weisletter, if I could only find it. Okay. Given the growth in poverty fueled in part by automation, is the solution basic income under capitalism or a democratically controlled economy / socialism? That's our first question. Our second question comes from BCL, who asks, do you think removing the capitalist profit motive from post-secondary schools will help the mental health of students? And our third question comes from someone that I had to silence because he was being disruptive in the chat, but he did say that he wanted to learn, and he did pose a meaningful question Uvia Azul, he asked, what is a militant labor union? Oh, those are the three questions.
Okay, Loretta, you're on. You have up to 4 minutes.
Okay. Am I can pick one of the questions?
Yes, you can pick 1, 2, or 3. So it's up to you which one you want to answer.
I think I'd like to hear number 2 again and try that one.
Okay, number 2, Kurt.
Sorry. Do you think removing the capitalist profit motive from post-secondary schools will help the mental health of students?
Definitely. There is a word I'm missing. Removing the capitalist profit modem. Is that it? Is that the word I'm missing?
Motive.
Oh. Removing the capitalist profit motive. Definitely. If I go back to what I was first saying about crimes, about what the real crimes are, I would definitely put that as a crime. The profits over people. It is so heartbreaking. I believe that is the number one problem for our youth today and their mental health and their depression. They have to try to figure out what they're going to do, but they have to, regarding their education, but they have to go into huge amounts of debt to try to get any headway in a system where people seem to think that students are supposed to get not just minimum wage, but less than minimum wage for the jobs that they do. And they think that students are supposed to be going to unpaid internships, and they think they're supposed to be volunteering all the time. I think this volunteering all the time, but at the same time, when they apply for a job, they're supposed to be having, lots of professional experience, paid experience. So it really would go a long way towards helping if you take away the profit motive from our educational systems.
Thank you, Loretta. Sebastian?
Okay. So I think I'll go with question 1 because this is an interesting debate that I always get with people. So that question, just to repeat it, was given the growth in poverty fueled in part by automation, is the solution universal basic income under capitalism or a democratically controlled economy or socialism? So I've had the UBI debate a lot with people across the political spectrum, and I think it's a really fascinating one because a lot of the communities that I work with are generally outside of the labor force, like they've never participated in the labor force. And that is because of these huge systemic barriers that don't actually allow them to play a part. So like for me, for example, like I've never paid into EI. Because because of like my queerness and like being trans and being an immigrant, it's very hard for me to secure like long-term work. So I've thought a lot about like what are the issues with basic income under capitalism, and I don't think I need to reiterate those because they've been discussed like very heavily. I think obviously socialism is the way, or taking capitalism out of our society and what it perpetuates is the way to go. But I also do think we need to think about, in a socialist society, how are we helping folks that because of disabilities, because of struggles with mental health, because of other systemic barriers that they face, how do we make sure that their bottom line is at least fulfilled and they have something that they can fall back on? Because I think it's really important for the mental health of folks that they be able to pull out of their work or pull out of what they're doing in the community, et cetera, so that they could kind of rest and recharge. And under a capitalist society, because there is no kind of social safety net, let's say, they really struggle to come up with rent and to come up with solutions as to how to deal with that. So I do think that we can make a bottom out kind of flat income that exists under a socialist condition. So if folks feel like they can't participate in the workforce or feel like they're up against some barriers, that at least they have their basic needs met. And I always really want to have a discussion of what exactly that looks like. So I guess to answer your question, socialism, but can we make sure that everyone has their needs met financially in terms of income under that system? And what does a guaranteed minimum income kind of look like in a socialist society, which is like a really interesting debate for me.
Thank you, Sebastian. Judy?
Yeah, poverty and homelessness is the great cause of mental illness, and so is prejudice against people with so-called mental illness. Like we used to have a saying in the Bain Cove where I live that no matter what you do, there's something wrong with you. It's just because you have a history of psychiatric illness.
Okay, thank you, comrade. Greg?
Thank you. Could I get question number 2 repeated to me, please? Actually, wait, I think I looked in the chat. Oh. Do you think removing the capitalist profit motive from post-secondary schools will help with the mental health of students? So to begin with that, Loretta already said that yes, it obviously would, but I'd like to take it a bit further back, because since you're in kindergarten, you're already thinking about the capitalist profit motive. What job do you want to do? How much money do you want to make? What kind of life do you want to live? And it's never really anything where it's like you can just do what makes you happy. It's something where you have to play into the expectations of society and your parents and things like that. So I think if we manage to get rid of the whole way capitalism influences children from a long age with the thinking of money as like the most important, oops, so sorry. Thinking of money as the most important like thing in life, I think that would drastically drop mental health illness rates among youth and adults, because you don't really drop it after you become an adult. So like what I'd like to say is that when you're a kid and you're given all this pressure about all of these different things and how to make money and you need to have a life, when you get to the point where you're actually able to decide, it's one of the most stressful things ever. I think you could ask anyone that choosing university or going post-secondary is one of the most stressful times of your life, when really it should be fun. It should be like a growing experience, leaving the nest. But under capitalist society, nothing can be fun or enjoyable. That's my answer for that question.
Okay, thank you, Greg. Daniel?
Hi. So no one tackled what is a militant union, so I'm going to do that one really quickly. So a militant union, as opposed to another union, is one that actually fights for its rank and file. So it's willing to engage in job action to win concessions from the bosses and to make sure that the workers get more and more, because in the end, workers are producing everything for that company. They should be getting everything, which would be more of a socialist thing. But in the meantime, fighting for increased wages, increased benefits, safer working conditions, more democratic say in how the company is run, more sick leave, more better maternity, paternity leave. And all these things would also help with mental health, obviously. So just better working conditions, more flexibility, all those things. And it's the militant unions that fight for that and are willing to engage in strikes, work to rule, just rolling strikes, etc. So that's what we need more of. Most of the unions right now are kind of feckless. Okay, so I do want to tackle the idea of UBI as well. So I agree a lot with what Sebastian said. Yeah, I guess a democratically controlled economy doesn't guarantee that all the people in that society, even if they're not doing anything, would have their needs met. So I definitely agree. There still needs to always be a struggle, even within a social society, to make sure everybody's needs are being taken care of. There's a slogan that gets brought up a lot that I agree with: from each according to their ability to each according to their need. So I think this is better actualized in a socialist society, with a democratically controlled economy, than in capitalism. So the issue with UBI, as it's pitched now, is basically the Band-Aid on a broken system, just like CERB is right now too, where it keeps people entangled with the system, where really at a certain point you're just going to need UBI to just make rent. In Toronto right now, if you're getting paid minimum wage, you need UBI just to make rent. It's not like a thing that gives you any sort of like luxurious life or even like decent. So it's really just offered up to prevent the conditions for a mass revolt, because we're really edging towards that right now, where people are going to be like, well, what choice do I have? Right now in the States, something like 10% of people are facing eviction if they don't renew the stay on evictions. That's crazy. If 10% of the people have been evicted, you have a mass of people that are going to be radicalized really quickly overnight. Like, why am I getting kicked out of my home when I've worked so hard in my whole life? So UBI is really the bare minimum concession to satisfy people so that they're not so desperate to organize radically. Now, unfortunately for the capitalists, that's already happening, but they're really trying to pitch UBI as a way of pushing that off so they can make as much profit in the meantime. So yeah, definitely democratically controlled economy so that people's needs can be met. Just make all the things that people need to survive, and that's it. Don't need to make extra. And also employ automation, because at that point, people don't necessarily need to work because their needs are being met, Anyways, I answered 1 in 3.
Okay, well, as moderator, seeing a question, a militant labor union, I can't help but speak up on this one, just a couple of lines. If you're looking for a militant labor union, you can look to the Canadian Union of Postal Workers, because they're the most militant union in North America and the most democratic as well. Now, they might not be as militant as they were years gone by. We may have slipped a little bit, but even with slippage, we are still the most militant union in North America. So I thought I had to slip that in. Okay, so Kurt, we have time for 3 more questions. So and the order this time, you will have up the same time, 4 minutes, and the order will be Greg, Judy, Sebastian, Loretta, and Daniel. Kurt.
Okay, so I'll be asking 4 questions because that's actually all the questions we have. So I think it would be in our best interest to add all the questions that were posed. And the first question is from myself, and I say the mass suicide of Indian farmers due to the debt trap they were forced into by Monsanto shows how capitalism can bring about depression and suicide. Could the panelists speak on this? The second question is from our fellow panelist, Daniel Terade. He says, I see many activists burn out in the struggle. How can we support the mental well-being of our activists in the mass struggle? And our next question is from BCL. Too many doctors use a just go for a walk to depressed patients who can barely function. Yes, it helps, but where is the support to get there? So, and then the next question is from Ellen Ramsey. Making concrete steps to change society is a good remedy for mental health crisis. Our society needs to offer more opportunities to participate. Do we ultimately need socialism to do this?
Okay, folks, you've heard the questions. The same format as before. If you wish to answer, you can, one or all, or not answer any. So we're going to start with Greg.
Thank you. I would like to answer question 2 and 3. So 2 was about the mental well-being of activists and how we can support them. So burnout is a thing because a lot of our work is completely volunteer work. You can rarely get paid to be an activist, but that's not what the point is, right? Despite that, despite activists doing good work, a lot of it seems thankless and a lot of it seems like you're not really affecting the waves of society at all. So the best way to support activists is if you know someone who's an activist or if you see an activist post, repost it, talk to them, have a discussion, show solidarity, because solidarity is one of the biggest things. We need a stronger sense of community. Capitalism has alienated us from each other incredibly hard. And we need to regrow, rebond, and talk to each other, because no one can do this struggle alone. We need to work together. All of our issues, they connect. And then for number 3, with the doctors using the just go for a walk rhetoric, I would like to say that the way we currently think of mental health in society is a bit outdated. We once again put the onus on the individual, because we can't fix, like, we can't create a society that will create healthy, happy people unless we get rid of capitalism and old colonialist views and laws and materialism. Until we get rid of all of those and put corporations in power, no one's going to want to cure the root problems, you know. So that has to come to the people. We have to push for proper mental health awareness and proper mental health care, because corporations won't do it for us. Big psychiatric firms won't do it for us. They make too much profit, right? We kind of live in a world where if you have an issue, you're kind of sent towards the medical route with pharmaceuticals more often, which isn't wrong, because if you need pharmaceuticals, you need pharmaceuticals. But some people just need actual therapy, and we don't offer people the right support. So that's all I have to say for those questions. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you, Greg. Okay, Judy, do you wish to answer either of these?
Well, yeah, I'd like to say that Native people are often, because of their poverty, if they live on reserves, they often have poverty. They don't have enough water. They don't have enough basic needs. And Native people that live in cities are often excluded from working, and they often turn to drinking or drugs, and that increases that decreases their mental health.
Thank you, Judy. Sebastian?
Okay, got it unmuted. Always, for some reason, I always have to it twice. I'm actually going to also answer question 2 and 3 because they were just so good, those 2 questions. So the first one is about activists. Now, I've actually made a pretty clear commitment with activist groups that I work with that I would not work with them unless they are willing to commit to develop a clear pathway to securing enough funding that they can actually meet the needs of the activists who do the work for them. So either that's through paying them or like helping them out with expenses like bills and food. And this again just goes back to the idea of community aid, community care, and mutual aid. If 10 folks who are really, really down for the cause but might not always show up to protest or might not want to take on leadership roles, are willing to donate 10 or 15% of their salary, or folks who came from like wealthier families might want to redistribute that wealth back into the community, we can make sure that people get paid and that their needs are met. So there's already the ability to do this. I mean, not-for-profits do this in the sense in which they take donations and then they use those donations to pay people. But we know that not-for-profits don't do particularly good work. So, well, sometimes they do, but sometimes they also don't do the work that's necessary or the work that they should be doing because of restrictions by the government on nonprofits. So we need activist collectives and people who can take money, kind of what we've seen in Minnesota, where they had frontline activists whose needs were met, but they were working hard and making sure that everything was taken care of on the ground. So I really think all activists collectives need to look at like how mutual aid and fundraising can go to also helping out activists themselves and making sure that their needs are met, because I think that's really important. On the third question, which was about like doctors prescribing a walk for burnout, I think that a lot of times cultural contexts are like really important when we look at how we deal with mental health. In New York City, which is actually where I grew, or partially where I grew up, there was a program for folks in the Afro-Latino community, which is where my dad is from. Many folks in the Afro-Latino community practice a spirituality called Santeria. And the New York public health officials had decided that for folks who are on Medicaid and who maybe got subsidies for therapeutic treatments if they were suffering from mental illness, that consultations that they had with like shamans and leaders in their community would be subsidized as therapy if it was proven to help people, in addition to CBT and other behavioral therapy training. And I think that's really important. Anishinaabe Health has a similar program for the Indigenous community here, where they integrate CBT and land-based teachings. And in a city like Toronto, and in many cities, especially in North America, which are cities comprised largely of people who are from other places in the city they reside in, we need to start looking just beyond doctors and just beyond what doctors could do to also work with people where they are and how they might have done something in their traditional way, in their traditional culture, and support that and foster that. Because for people being, you know, things that are culturally relevant are really, really helpful at tackling the mental health crisis. Because before capitalism, we were all something else. You know, our ancestors were all something else. So it's really important to honor that and honor that tradition. So not just always looking to a doctor, but trying to expand the idea of who can play what role in somebody's mental well-being. And that's it.
Okay. Thank you, Sebastian. Okay, Loretta?
Mm,
Go ahead, Loretta, when you're ready.
Okay, I think that there was a question about how social activists can avoid burnout. Maybe that was the
Yes, it
issue.
was the question.
I do have a brief idea, although it has been mentioned a lot by the previous speakers. I feel since capitalism divides, alienates, and pits us against each other in angry, polarizing, blaming games where we end up punching our fists downwards instead of fighting the real enemy that is the elite. Well, the real enemy has actually had a plan for a long time, which has involved indoctrinating our children from the beginning to make them think that the police are good and helping them, to make them believe that the government is good and is helping them. I believe burnout, we have to fight it because of all of this. You know, around us, the entire environment around us is so full of the idea that socialists are evil. I see it everywhere. I turn around, I look on the TV, and we've got them talking about it from just read all of Margaret Thatcher's speeches about socialism, about socialists. That has been ingrained. I mean, whether she was popular or not, it does not matter. That has been ingrained all across the Commonwealth. So social activists, I believe, our collectives really should punch it up. Yes, I mean that, by actually possibly being more active in helping the people that we are fighting for. So I heard Sebastian talking about that, about how we need to do some funding for particular groups. And I think that if social activist collectives could be more active in, like, I don't know, just sending out food boxes, getting together to work with everyone to find out what people need in the community, so that the community will see socialism as what it really is instead of what it has been written down for over a century now. And I think that's the best way to avoid burnout. Thank you.
Thank you, Loretta. Daniel?
Yeah, thank you, Elizabeth. So when I'm last on the speaker list for answering the questions, I feel obligated to answer the ones that haven't been addressed yet. So to Kurt's question about the debt trap in India with the farmers, this is something I've thought a lot about in the past. with the Green Revolution, that was when a lot of the agrochemicals and genetically modified organisms and hybrid crops from North America got brought to Asia. And that meant that farmers are now tied to this system. You had to buy seeds every year because the same practice of keeping the seeds and then using them next year either wouldn't work because it was a hybrid crop, or it was made illegal because it was a patented organism. And then also the only benefit of that genetically modified crop really is that it's resistant to their proprietary pesticide. So it means that if your crop failed one year, you can't afford seeds for your next year, which means now you're just destitute. So you have this horrible, horrible tragedy of just entire communities just disappearing because the crop failed in this entire region, not enough water, too much water, whatever. And there's no way out of it. They bought out all the local seed companies. They're all gone. And you've been so alienated from what you've been doing for so long that there's no other recourse. So it's an awful, awful thing. And then to add some sort of perverse irony on top of it, it's very common in places like Sri Lanka. The common method of suicide is to ingest the pesticides, which have been brought over as well. They're so toxic. So what they've done is they've banned very toxic pesticides and they've switched it to the less toxic ones, which meant that the suicide rate has like plummeted. But it's not because people's material conditions have improved. They're still drinking poison at the same rate as before. They're just not dying. They're just in agony in a hospital, and they'll eventually recover to who knows what kind of quality of life. So that's we need to do things to prevent suicide now, to intervene now in the opioid crisis. But if you don't address what drove a person to addiction in the first place, drove a person to self-harm, what drove a person to despair, you're just going to prolong their suffering. If you just cut off one way of escape and not do anything else, to me, that's cruel. And that's capitalism, because they don't care if you're happy. They just want you alive so they can exploit your labor. So I think what happened historically in Sri Lanka it's just a microcosm of that. For the question, do we need a socialism to provide more opportunities for participation? Yeah, I think that's something we're kind of talking about with respect to the burnout. Yes, community organizations is a way to also combat the alienation. We want to be involved in our communities. We want to say in our communities. We want to be able to connect with other like-minded people. And we want other people's compassion. We want to be able to give compassion to other people. And I think for me, that getting involved with Socialist Action and other activist groups in the past has been the only time I've been genuinely at peace with what I'm doing. There are other times I'm happy, but it's more of a distraction. So this is really something I think is going to build upon itself. And I love the idea that Lorelei brought up and Sebastian brought up of this community aid, and we can perpetuate a socialist project that's self-sufficient and is a great little demonstration of what this really is in practice, where people contribute as much as they can and they receive as much as they need, because that's equity, and that's what is needed. Like anything else beyond that is perverse to me. And so that is really the rhetoric, and to explain that people needing aid is not them being lazy. It's the capitalists who are lazy because they don't do any work. They just invest their money that they probably got because they inherited it. And now they have billions of dollars. That to me is, they don't deserve any of it as far as I'm concerned. So I appreciate this panel. It was great to meet some new comrades, and thank you everybody for your questions.
Okay. Thank you very much, Daniel. A special thanks to, of course, to Daniel, Judy, Greg, Loretta, and Sebastian. And of course, to our producer, Kurt Young in Mississauga, and to everyone who participated in tonight's conversation. Please consider buying a subscription to Socialist Action newspaper, only $25 for 1 year, delivered to your door. And to fill out the form, just visit our website at www.socialistaction.ca. And if you would like to talk to us about joining SA, write to socialistactioncanada@gmail.com, or just give us a call at 647-986-1917. That's 647-986-1917. Once again, if you like this show, please subscribe to the Socialist Action YouTube channel. And this weekend, comrades, marks the 20th anniversary of the passing of a great working class labor union, International Solidarity and Socialist leader, Joe Flexer. On Sunday, August the 2nd at 2 p.m., there will be a gathering to honor the memory of Joe at Bathurst Lawn Memorial Park, which is 6033 Bathurst Street, about 6 blocks north of Drury Avenue, 9 blocks south of Steeles, west in Toronto. The grave is in the United Jewish People's Order section of the cemetery. So if you want to learn about the history of the left in Canada, come on out on Sunday. Now, our next essay webcast is on Thursday, August the 6th at 7 p.m. It is titled The Formation of the Canadian Colonial Settler State, with author and longtime socialist John Riddell, University of Manitoba Professor of History Peter Kolchitsky, and discussant Maria Paez Victor, a leading Venezuelan solidarity activist, and I will be hosting the show. So for the details, just visit www.socialistaction.ca. So in the meantime and between time, please stay safe, stay healthy, and be active. Bye for now.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.
Bye, everybody.